He dug with his hands to save the farm, but instead of water, he found something that had been hidden underground for decades. Look what happened when the hatch opened. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land had forgotten what it meant to breathe. Cracks like ancient scars spread across the fields in all directions, splitting the ground into jagged shapes that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Dust rose in faint clouds with every step, clinging to the air and settling back in layers so thick it dulled the colors of everything it touched. The few trees that remained stood as withered skeletons, their bark dry and brittle, their branches empty and gray. Above it all hung the sun, relentless and heavy, suspended in a pale sky without a single cloud to soften its gaze. It had been there for months, blazing with unyielding cruelty, and there was no sign it intended to leave. Daniel West stood at the edge of his ruined fields, his boots sinking slightly into the powdery soil. Once, these acres had been alive, bursting with rows of corn and wheat, green shoots pushing toward the sky with strength and promise. His grandfather had broken this ground with his own hands, convinced that hard work would carve a future for the family. He had been right, for a time. The farm had seen good years, years when harvests filled the silos, and neighbors came together to help load wagons brimming with grain. But those years now felt like fragments from a dream, fading more with each season. What stretched before Daniel now was emptiness, a hollow imitation of what had been, a place where nothing would grow. The farm had belonged to his family for 3 generations. His grandfather, a man who had returned from war with little more than a vision of stability, had chosen this land when others passed it by. He had seen potential where no one else dared. Daniel's father had inherited that vision, tending the soil and expanding the farm, raising his children among the rows of corn, believing that the earth would always answer their loyalty with abundance. But then the rains slowed, first in short spells, then in seasons that came and went with hardly a drop. By the time the drought took full hold, it was no longer a visitor, but a tyrant, one that refused to leave. Daniel was a man of middle years, his skin marked by the sun, his body lean and corded, with the kind of strength that comes only from years of labor. His hands told his story better than his words ever could. Thick calluses had built up over decades of work, but now they were broken, cracked, and bleeding from constant strain. He carried the burden of responsibility not as a choice, but as a weight bound to him by blood. His grandfather had left him the land with pride. His father had added to it with care. And now, Daniel felt himself standing at the edge of failure, unable to keep alive what had been entrusted to him. Every morning he woke to silence. No rooster crowed, no cows lowed with hunger. The animals he still had, 2 cows and 1 weary horse, moved like shadows, their ribs showing, their eyes dull. He carried water to them in rusted buckets from a shallow stream that had shrunk to a trickle miles away. Each trip was torture. The heat blistered his skin, the handles cut into his palms, and by the time he returned, half the water had sloshed away. Yet he could not bring himself to give up. He rationed every drop, sometimes choosing to give it to the animals instead of himself, as though their survival mattered more than his. The crops had long since surrendered. Corn stalks stood brittle and colorless. Wheat had withered into nothing more than dry straw. He had tried to save a small patch of vegetables near the house, bending to pour water into the roots each morning, whispering silent pleas for them to hold on. But even they had turned yellow and shriveled, their leaves curling into themselves as though in shame. Every effort ended the same: withered stalks, empty soil, defeat staring him in the face. Neighbors had once lived on the nearby farms, families who shared work and hardship, who lent each other tools and traded seeds. Now their houses were abandoned. Roofs sagged, windows shattered, doors swung open with the wind. The road that once carried wagons and laughter was overgrown with weeds, untended and forgotten. Daniel's farm had become an island, a lonely relic surrounded by silence. At night, the only sounds were the moaning of the wind across the barren fields and the distant howl of coyotes, sharp reminders that life existed elsewhere, even if it had abandoned his land. He thought often of leaving, packing what little he had left and moving to the city, taking odd jobs until he could find a steady wage. But the idea cut into him like a blade. To leave would be to betray his grandfather's faith, his father's labor, his own years of sacrifice. It would mean surrendering to a force he could not fight. And though he had nothing left to give, some stubborn part of him refused to walk away. He was bound to this earth, even if it was dying. That was when he made his decision. If the land would not give him water freely, then he would dig until he found it. He had no money for machinery, no way to hire a drilling crew, but he had his hands, his will, and his tools. In the shed leaned a lopsided shovel, its wooden handle splintered, its blade worn thin by years of use. Beside it sat an old pickaxe, rusted but still strong enough to cut into the soil. He gathered them, slung them over his shoulder, and walked to a spot near the barn, where the earth seemed just a little darker, where his father once claimed an underground stream might lie. The first swing of the shovel sank barely an inch before the blade struck resistance. The soil was as hard as stone, baked solid by months of sun. Sweat broke across his forehead instantly, dripping into his eyes, but he pressed on. Each thrust sent vibrations up his arms. Each pull left his shoulders aching. He fell into a rhythm. Dig, lift, throw. The sound of metal scraping against unyielding earth echoing through the silence. Hours passed, and all he gained was a shallow pit lined with dry dust. That night he collapsed onto his bed, his muscles screaming in protest. His hands were raw, new blisters swelling where calluses had broken. Yet even as exhaustion pulled him into uneasy sleep, he dreamed of water. Clear, cool water rising from the earth, filling his well, pouring into his fields, bringing back the life that had vanished. He woke with the image burned into him and knew he would return to the pit again. On the second day, he worked longer, his body straining beyond reason. He struck rocks, pulled them out one by one, tossing them aside with curses that vanished into the empty air. Dust coated his tongue, making him choke, but he did not stop. The pit deepened, the walls rising around him, but still there was no sign of moisture. The ground remained stubborn, bone dry, and the air shimmered with heat that seemed to mock him. By nightfall, he was dizzy, his vision blurred by exhaustion. But again he dreamed of water, and again he returned. On the third day, he moved with the determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. His arms shook with each swing. His breath came ragged. His chest burned with every gasp of air. He was covered in dust and sweat, his shirt clinging to him, his skin cracked and bleeding. The pit was deep now, nearly over his head, and shadows stretched across it as the sun climbed high. Still he dug, still he refused to stop, even when every part of him begged for rest. The earth gave him nothing, only silence. But Daniel West had long ago accepted that silence was the language of survival. He would dig until his body failed him, because he could not do otherwise. This land was his blood, his curse, his inheritance. Even as despair clawed at him, he clung to the faintest spark of hope, the dream that somewhere beneath the cracked skin of the earth, water still waited. And so he pressed the blade of his shovel into the soil again, unaware that the next sound he heard would change everything. The sound came at first as nothing more than an odd vibration through the wooden handle of the shovel. Daniel had been buried in the rhythm of his labor, his mind dulled by exhaustion and the constant scrape of metal against unyielding dirt. But this was different. The strike did not return the dry crunch of stone or the muffled thud of packed soil. It rang, clear and sharp, like a bell struck in the depths of the earth. He froze, his body hunched over the pit, sweat dripping from his brow, listening to the echo that still hummed faintly around him. It was a sound foreign to this place, unnatural against the background of silence he had come to know so well. For a long moment he could not move. His heart beat hard in his chest, stronger than it had in months. The thought that he had finally struck stone was quickly banished. No stone ever gave such a hollow metallic response. He lifted the shovel again, his arms trembling from fatigue, and drove it back into the same spot. The same ringing cry answered, slightly muffled by the surrounding soil but undeniable. Metal. There was metal buried beneath his land. The sudden rush of energy that coursed through him almost frightened him. It was as though the earth itself had spoken back to him after months of silence, and the voice it gave was not one of water or salvation, but of secrets. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the soil with his hands, heedless of the pain, as dirt ground beneath his fingernails and fresh cuts opened across his palms. Fistful by fistful, he cleared away the layers until the surface beneath began to reveal itself. At first, it was only a curved edge, dark with rust and earth, but as he worked, the shape grew clearer. It was not a pipe, nor some discarded tool. What he uncovered was a rim, smooth and deliberate, widening into a circle that spread beneath him. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled away more soil, each handful unveiling more of the strange, buried shape. The object stretched wider than his arms could reach, a perfect circumference that spoke of design, not chance. And in its center, faint but distinct, was the outline of a lock, heavy and corroded, but still whole. Daniel sat back on his heels, staring at what he had uncovered. A round iron hatch lay beneath his farm, hidden all these years under layers of dust and rock. The surface was rough and pitted, eaten by time, but the structure itself remained intact. The edges were fused with the soil as though the earth had tried to reclaim it, but it resisted, enduring silently while generations passed above. A shiver of unease crept through him despite the heat. There was no reason for such a thing to exist here, no explanation that sat comfortably in his mind. Old tanks, cisterns, even buried trash from decades past, he had seen all those before, and this was none of them. This was purposeful, intentional, and meant to be hidden. He tried to convince himself to stop, to cover it again, to walk away and forget. But his body would not obey. His hands, raw and bloodied, continued to dig. He worked along the edges, pulling at roots that had knotted themselves across the hatch, tugging them free until they snapped. Each movement revealed more of the circle, its silent presence growing more undeniable. He had expected only dirt and failure. Now he faced a mystery older and heavier than his own despair. As the sun slid lower in the sky, the ground beneath him shifted. Soil crumbled along the pit walls, sending small cascades of dust and rock down into the hollow. He scrambled back as the earth gave a sigh, subtle at first, then louder, cracks spreading outward like veins across the surface. From those fractures, something unexpected emerged. A glisten, faint and fleeting, but real. Moisture seeped through the dry earth, beating along the cracks and trickling downward. Daniel froze again, this time overcome not by fear, but by wonder. He touched the damp soil with trembling fingers, feeling its coolness, its truth. Water. Not much, only a thin seepage, but enough to darken the dust and send a faint smell of life rising from the ground. For a man who had lived in drought, that single damp touch was a miracle. The water ran toward the hatch, gathering along the edges of the metal rim, tracing its lines, until it looked as though the iron itself was bleeding. Thin streams slid down into the seams, marking the ancient shape with dark stains. Daniel watched, torn between awe and unease, as the two forces, life-giving water and the strange, buried iron, met in silence. He pressed his ear against the hatch, ignoring the grit that scratched his skin. From beneath came only a muffled stillness, heavy and complete, but his imagination filled it with possibilities. What was sealed here? Why had it been buried beneath his farm? His heart thudded in his chest with the rhythm of fear and curiosity, and he knew he could no longer leave it alone. He reached for the pickaxe and set its edge against the corroded lock. The first strike sent a shower of rust and soil falling away, the sound echoing strangely in the hollow beneath. He struck again, harder this time, each swing a battle not only with the metal, but with his own hesitation. The lock groaned, protesting, but held fast. Sweat poured down his back, his arms screamed with effort, but he continued until cracks appeared along the rusted surface. The ground shuddered faintly under him, as though disturbed by the violence. More water seeped from the spreading cracks in the soil, trickling steadily now, darkening the earth around him. His boots grew damp, the dust clinging to them turning to mud. The air smelled of iron and wet stone, a strange mixture of decay and renewal. The pit had become a place where hope and dread mingled, inseparable. He paused only once, leaning heavily against the shaft of the pickaxe, breathing hard. His body demanded rest, but his mind burned with the need to know. He lifted the tool once more, brought it down with every ounce of remaining strength, and the lock gave way with a tortured scream. A cloud of rust fell in flakes, scattering like old ash, and the hatch shivered slightly in its setting. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel lowered the pickaxe slowly, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, his eyes fixed on the circular door that now seemed almost alive. Around it the earth was dark with moisture, as though the land itself had been awakened, whispering of things buried and forgotten. Night was approaching, the sky streaked with orange and purple, but Daniel could not leave. His entire world had shrunk to the circle of iron before him, the damp soil beneath his hands, the knowledge that something long hidden waited just beyond his reach. Exhaustion warred with determination, and he knew that tomorrow he would return to finish what he had begun. He climbed from the pit slowly, his body aching, his clothes soaked with sweat and streaked with mud. Behind him the hatch glimmered faintly in the fading light, circled by darkened soil where the water seeped. It looked less like an object now, and more like a wound in the land, one that had been torn open by his desperate search for salvation. Daniel stood at the edge of the pit and looked out over his fields, the emptiness stretching away in every direction. For the first time in months, the silence felt different. Not just the silence of death, but the silence before revelation, before truth. He turned his eyes back to the hatch, knowing he had uncovered more than he ever intended. The promise of water and the threat of secrets now lay intertwined, and he had no choice but to face them both. The night closed in, but sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, haunted by the memory of that ringing sound, the feel of damp soil, the image of rusted iron bleeding in the earth. In the darkness of his small house, he felt the weight of the hatch pressing up through the ground, calling to him with a voice that was neither kind nor cruel, only insistent. Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow he would open it. Morning came with the same harsh light as every other day, the sun already fierce before it had risen high, the sky pale and pitiless. Daniel woke with the weight of the discovery pressing against his chest, as if the hatch beneath his land, had followed him into the night, whispering through his dreams. His body ached from the labor of the day before, muscles heavy and stiff, hands swollen and raw, yet his mind would not allow him to remain still. He rose with the urgency of a man who could not turn away, gathered his tools again, and walked back to the pit with steps that quickened the closer he came. The hatch waited there, silent and immovable, half buried in the soil that had darkened from the faint seepage of water. Overnight, the moisture had spread, leaving damp stains across the ground, the edges glistening faintly in the early light. Daniel crouched at the rim of the pit, staring down at the iron circle. Its presence filled the hollow like a living thing, the air thick with the smell of rust and wet earth. It no longer seemed inanimate. It seemed to breathe in the silence, as though aware of his return. He climbed into the pit, boots sinking into the damp soil, and laid his hands against the cold surface. The iron was rough beneath his skin, the seams traced with mud where the trickling water had gathered. He pressed his weight against the edge, testing it, and felt it shift, the faintest suggestion of movement beneath decades of earth. The sound it gave was a low groan, metallic and weary, like the voice of something long buried, protesting against the intrusion. He braced himself and pulled harder. At first the hatch resisted, refusing to yield. He struck the rim with the shovel, sending vibrations through the air. Again he pulled, muscles straining, back bent, teeth clenched. Then at last, with a sudden heave, the seal broke. A loud, grating shriek tore through the silence, the sound of rust grinding against rust, of bolts and hinges breaking free after years of stillness. Dust and flakes of iron rained down, and slowly, unwillingly, the hatch swung open. At once the ground around him shifted again. The cracks widened, and thin streams of water seeped faster, dark rivulets curling through the soil. They trickled into the pit, gathering in shallow pools at his feet, soaking into the earth and sliding along the hatch. The sight struck him with a mixture of wonder and dread. The drought had starved the land for years, yet here, at the mouth of this buried secret, water began to emerge. Not in abundance, not enough to save his fields, but enough to make the soil darken, enough to remind him of life. From within the opened hatch came a rush of air, sharp and sudden. It carried with it the coldness of a sealed tomb, stale and heavy, yet tinged with something else, a smell of metal and stone and faint, bitter chemicals. The gust swept over him, chilling his sweat-soaked skin, raising the hair along his arms. For a moment he almost closed the hatch again, driven by instinct to seal away whatever breathed below. But his hands did not obey. The pull of curiosity, of necessity, was stronger than his fear. He lowered himself carefully, his boots finding the top rungs of a steel ladder that descended into the dark. His flashlight shook in his grip as he switched it on, its beam cutting a narrow path downward. The light reflected off damp surfaces, glistening where the water had already begun to trace lines along the walls. Each rung was slick with rust, cold against his hands. The air grew colder as he descended, the silence broken only by the sound of his own breath and the distant drip of water falling from unseen cracks. When he reached the bottom, his feet landed on solid concrete, the echo of his step reverberating in the wide chamber. He lifted his flashlight slowly, sweeping it across the space. The beam revealed a vast room supported by iron beams that stretched overhead like the ribs of a giant beast. Dust lay thick over everything, muting the shapes, yet the outlines remained clear. Rows of wooden crates and metal boxes stood in careful order, stacked neatly as though awaiting use. Their surfaces bore faded symbols, remnants of paint that once marked them with army insignias, now blurred by time. Some of the crates had split open, their contents exposed. Inside lay gas masks, the rubber stiff and cracked, glass lenses clouded by age. Rusted tools glimmered faintly, edges eaten away but still sharp enough to gleam under the light. Glass bottles sat in rows, their liquid contents long since evaporated, leaving behind only stains and crystals along the sides. The smell was strong here, a mingling of rust, mold, and chemicals that clung to the air, thick and oppressive. The beam of light moved further, landing upon a wooden desk at the heart of the room. Its surface was buried beneath papers, yellowed and curled, scattered in disarray, as though someone had left in a hurry. A broken lamp leaned across them, its glass shattered, the cord frayed. Daniel approached slowly, his boots stirring the dust into faint clouds. He reached out and lifted a notebook, its cover torn, its pages stiff with age. The handwriting within was shaky, but still readable. Words pressed into the paper with the weight of urgency. The first entries spoke plainly of construction, of the building of the bunker during a time of war. But it was not described as a place of refuge. It had been built for storage, for preparation, for secrecy should the fighting reach this land. The man who had once owned the farm before Daniel's family had lived here had been ordered to keep it hidden, to guard it as part of a larger plan. Daniel's eyes moved across the words slowly, the truth sinking into him like the chill of the air around him. Beside the notebook lay a bundle of letters tied together with string, the paper brittle yet intact. He lifted them gently, the string breaking at his touch, the letters spilling into his hands. Most were addressed to someone named Clara. They were written with a trembling hand, filled with words of fear, regret, and secrets too heavy to share aloud. Each letter was a confession, each page carrying the weight of a man haunted by the burden of what he guarded. Daniel held them for a long time, feeling the fragility of the paper, the echoes of another man's fear, before laying them back on the desk with quiet respect. Against one wall stood an old radio, its surface cloaked in dust. The dials and knobs were still intact, though tarnished with age. Beside it sat a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed but whole. 4 words were scrawled across the front. For when it's found. Above the radio, hanging loosely from rusted nails, was a flag. Its colors had faded into near nothing, its fabric thin and fragile, as though a touch might turn it to dust. It swayed faintly in the cold air, a silent relic of forgotten loyalty. At the far end of the chamber stood another door, its frame heavy, its surface scarred by rust, but still solid. Daniel set his flashlight upon it, the beam revealing its worn handle. He stepped closer, laying his hand against the cold metal, and felt it yield slightly under pressure. Unlike the hatch above, this one wasn't locked. With effort, he pulled it open, the hinges screeching in protest, flakes of rust raining down. Beyond stretched a tunnel, long and narrow, vanishing into blackness. The beam of his flashlight reached only a short distance before the dark swallowed it whole. From within drifted air colder than the chamber, an icy breath that carried with it the faintest sound. At first he thought it was only the ringing in his ears from exhaustion, but as he listened, it grew clearer. A hum, distant but steady, like a machine still alive somewhere deep within the earth. Daniel stood there, gripping the frame of the door, his heart pounding. Behind him lay the chamber, filled with relics of war and silence, the weight of history pressing in. Before him stretched a darkness alive with mystery, with a sound that suggested something beyond simple storage, something that endured. The water dripped steadily from the ceiling, echoing like a clock counting down time. He felt the pull of the tunnel, the invitation and the warning bound together. But the weight of what he had already seen pressed him back. He could not yet face what lay deeper. With one last look into the endless black, he closed the door slowly, its groan echoing like a sigh. When he climbed back to the surface, the air above felt thin and sharp, the sun glaring down as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. In his hands he carried the notebook and the letters, pressed close to his chest. Around the hatch the earth was damp, water still seeping, pooling faintly before sinking back into the soil. It was not enough to save his crops, not enough to end the drought, but it was something, a sign of life, a sign that beneath the scars of the land lay secrets both hopeful and terrible. He stood at the edge of the pit, the papers trembling in his hands, his mind filled with questions. This was no simple discovery. It was not just a chance meeting of metal and earth. It was a secret buried by fear, guarded in silence, and released only by desperation. The water and the hatch had come together, symbols of survival and destruction entwined, and he, by digging with his own blistered hands, had been chosen to uncover them. The climb out of the pit left Daniel's muscles trembling, but it was not only exhaustion that made his hands shake as he pulled himself into the light. He clutched the bundle of papers to his chest, careful not to crush their fragile edges. The morning sun blazed overhead, but he barely felt its heat. His thoughts remained far below, trapped in the damp chamber of dust, rust, and secrets. Around the mouth of the hatch the earth was damp, dark patches spreading wider than they had the day before. Water still seeped, trickling down in thin threads that vanished into the soil, leaving behind a faint smell of wet stone. The sight of it filled him with a strange comfort, though it did not outweigh the unease of what else had been uncovered. He turned away from the pit at last, his boots heavy with mud, and walked slowly back to the house. The night that followed offered little rest. His dreams were tangled, heavy with images of metal boxes and faded flags, of letters written with trembling hands, of the tunnel that stretched endlessly into the dark. He woke often, drenched in sweat despite the cool air that seeped through the broken seams of the house. Each time he woke, his ears strained for a sound he could not name, as if the faint hum from the tunnel below had followed him up through the soil, embedding itself in the silence of his home. When dawn came again, pale and merciless, he knew he would have to return. The pit looked unchanged in the early light, but he felt its weight from a distance. The open hatch yawned like a wound in the ground, and the damp soil around it was darker still, moisture clinging to the earth in defiance of the sun. He descended the ladder slowly, carrying the flashlight, and forcing himself to breathe evenly. The cold met him again at the bottom, wrapping around his body like a shroud. His boots splashed faintly in shallow puddles that had not been there before. The water was finding its way into the bunker now, dripping steadily from cracks above, running along the floor in thin veins that glittered under the light. The chamber remained as he had left it, silent and heavy, its rows of crates standing like soldiers long abandoned. The notebook and letters he had taken rested upstairs, but he could still feel their absence here, as if the room mourned the loss of its voice. His eyes swept over the objects he had not studied fully before, the shattered glass bottles lined with crystalline residue, the gas masks with their empty eyes, the rusted tools that once promised destruction. Each relic spoke of preparation for a war that had never come here, yet lingered still, entombed in secrecy. His steps led him back to the door at the far wall. He had closed it once, but its presence haunted him more than the crates and the letters ever could. He could not ignore the memory of the air that drifted out when he first opened it. Colder, sharper, carrying with it that faint, steady hum. The thought of what lay beyond filled him with both dread and inevitability. He pressed his hand to the handle once more, the metal freezing against his skin, and pulled. The door yielded with the same groan as before, the darkness beyond yawning open, the sound of rust falling like soft rain at his feet. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and low, its ceiling arched with stone and lined with iron beams that disappeared into shadow. The beam of his flashlight reached only a short distance before the dark swallowed it whole, leaving the rest to imagination. Moisture clung to the walls, dripping steadily into shallow pools along the floor. Each step he took echoed faintly, magnified by the enclosed space, merging with the hum that grew stronger as he moved deeper. It was not loud, but it was steady, a mechanical rhythm that should not have survived the years. Daniel's breath quickened as he advanced, the chill settling deeper into his bones. The tunnel seemed endless, and yet he felt himself drawn forward, compelled by the sound that waited at its end. His flashlight beam landed on strange markings along the walls. Stenciled numbers faded into obscurity, chalk lines that had not been touched in decades. They stood as reminders of the men who had built this place, men who had carried secrets into the ground and sealed them away, expecting them never to be found. At last, the tunnel widened into a smaller chamber, circular and plain. Here the hum was louder, reverberating off the stone until it filled the space. Against one wall stood a large machine, its surface cloaked in rust and dust, but its shape unmistakable. Pipes protruded from its sides, valves and gauges still intact, though corroded. A faint vibration pulsed through its frame, subtle yet undeniable. Somehow, against all reason, it was still alive. He approached cautiously, running his hand along the metal surface. It was cold, slick with condensation, yet thrumming faintly beneath his palm. He had no way of knowing what purpose it once served, whether it was meant to pump air, to filter water, or to power something hidden deeper still. The letters and the notebook had hinted at secrecy, at fear, at burdens too heavy to carry. Perhaps this machine was at the heart of it all, a device meant to sustain or destroy, forgotten in the soil while generations above lived unaware. He stood there a long while, the flashlight beam trembling as his arm grew weak, his breath loud in the silence. The decision before him was unspoken, yet clear. He could leave now, close the hatch above, bury the knowledge again, and pretend it was never uncovered. Or he could reveal it, bring others here, risk the consequences of what they might do with what lay hidden. Either choice weighed heavy, but the greater weight was that he now knew. He had seen, he had touched, and he could not return to ignorance. The water dripping from the ceiling struck the floor in rhythmic taps, mingling with the hum of the machine, until it sounded like a heartbeat, slow and unending. He closed his eyes and listened, feeling both the threat and the promise of what lay beneath his farm. When he finally turned away, his steps were heavy but resolute. He retraced his path through the tunnel, through the chamber of crates and relics, past the desk and the broken lamp, and up the ladder that led to the surface. The sunlight was blinding when he emerged, the sudden warmth startling after the cold below. He stood at the edge of the pit, breathing hard, clutching the edges of the hatch. Around him the earth was darker still, damp patches, spreading wider as the water continued to seep. It was not enough to fill his fields, not enough to save his farm, but it was a sign that life had not abandoned the land completely. Daniel closed the hatch slowly, the iron groaning as it settled back into place. He left it unlocked, the rusted lock shattered beyond repair. The papers and letters he had taken he carried back to the house, their weight greater than their fragile bodies suggested. They were his proof, his inheritance, and his burden. He knew the farm would never be the same, that his life would never again be untouched by what lay below. The secret was his now, bound to him by the act of discovery. As the sun sank low over the barren fields, casting long shadows across the broken soil. Daniel stood with the papers in his hands and looked out at the land that had shaped his life. Water glimmered faintly in the cracks, the smallest promise of renewal. But beneath it, deeper than any drought could touch, the past still breathed, sealed away in iron and stone. He had opened it, and though he had chosen to close it again, he knew the silence would never be as complete as it once had been. The earth itself had spoken, and its voice would haunt him always. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.